All right, so we're going to start off with the levels tool, and I want to give you a couple quick tips on using it in both darktable and GIMP. Even though we've used it before or talked about it before, I want to give you some additional tips on using it. So let's jump into darktable here, and we're going to take a look at this image right here. And hopefully you've already imported all these images from the section 3 folder. If not, go ahead and do that, because we're going to be using a lot of these images in this section and the next section. So go ahead and grab that image. And let's go into darkroom. Now at first glance, you can tell that the image is very flat or lacks contrast, and the histogram confirms that. So I like to start off by reviewing my histogram to determine what part of the tonal range needs to be fixed. And you can see in this histogram that there's no detail in the blacks and very little in the shadows, and there's no detail in the whites or the highlights either. So those are two things we need to fix. We need to fix the whites, highlights, blacks, and shadows. And we can do that by starting off with adjusting the white and black point. So the purest white and the purest black point of the image. Now, in most cases, in most images, you want a full tonal range if it was available at the time of capture. So this is I would say, a low contrast image. At least the dynamic range is low contrast. So that's why this person, whoever photographed this, it wasn't me, ended up with a low contrast image. Now they could have increased their exposure settings to make the image brighter to fill in these gaps. So you want to try and do that as much as possible in camera. If you can't, then you can come into darkroom and use your levels tool to adjust the white and black point. So we can do that by going to the color grading grouping here and accessing the levels tool. Now, once you begin adjusting one of these sliders here, it will then show the histogram. So this is the white point over here on the right, black is over here. And what I'd like to do is I like to adjust everything to the edges of the histogram. So I'm going to take the black point right there because that's where the histogram begins, and then the white point over here to the left. So just like that, we've increased the dynamic range of the image and we've added contrast in the process, so it's not as flat as it was before. Now, the one thing you want to be careful of is not placing these markers on the inside of the histogram like this, because you're going to start losing detail. So everything on the right side of this marker now is gone. All that detail is gone, and we can confirm that with our clipping indicator right here. So once I turn that on, we get a big red overlay. So all those pixels have been deleted. And then in some points of the foreground here, you see some blue overlay. So that's pure black. So we've lost detail on that part of the image. So we can adjust that by moving this to the left to try and bring back some of that detail in the foreground. Now, a lot of it you're not really going to see, but I think the sky is important, so I'm going to go ahead and move this back to the right, and then that overlay begins to disappear as I bring detail back into those parts of the image. So it's not necessary to go right to the edge. Sometimes you may need to keep a little bit of a gap just to ensure you're not clipping any detail. You don't want to always fill the gap completely. Again, this is all dependent on each individual image and your creative vision for a particular edit. Now, real quick, before we jump into GIMP, I have some tips about the clipping indicator here, because right now you're probably getting different results than I am, and that's because I've set up the settings for my clipping indicator versus using the default settings. And if you hover over this, you're going to see a little tooltip. It says toggle clipping indication, right click for options. So go ahead and right click, and you can see my clipping preview mode is luminance only. So I like to set mine to luminance only versus full gamut, which is the default, because I want to see what part of the image the brightness levels are being clipped. So the whites or the blacks or the black points and the white points. So that's what I recommend using the clipping indicator for, is for the tonal adjustments. So I would set that to luminance only, and then you can change the color scheme to something else if red and blue isn't for you. And then you have different thresholds. So my numbers here are probably different from yours because I've adjusted these. And when you hover over the lower threshold here, this is going to give you a pop-up window for the black points, and it's going to give you some ideas to what settings you should use based on your output. So if you're using an 8-bit sRGB, it's going to clip the blacks at minus 12.69 EV. 8 bits Adobe RGB is minus 19, so on and so forth. And then you can see if you're going to do a glossy print, it's minus 8. Now, which setting you use is dependent on your output, but also based on your individual image, because if you're shooting Nikon, Canon, Sony, or whatever the case may be, it might be slightly different from one camera to another as well, especially when it comes to the upper threshold, because it's not going to really give you any information about the output, because pure white isn't really going to be printed on paper, but black is a solid color ink that is usually used during the printing process, not so much white. So the upper threshold here, you're going to have to experiment with based on your own images, and I find right around 90–95% works the majority of the time. So if I take this upper threshold and move it to the left and lower the threshold, Darktable is now saying that that part of the sky is overexposed, even though we can visually see that it's not. Okay, so now that I have it turned off, I can still see color in there. So it's not really being clipped, and that's why you want to be careful with your settings here. So I'm going to set this back to around 90%, and I think that works pretty good for this image. All right, so let's go ahead and click right here to reset those parameters, and then go ahead and go into Light Table and export it as a 8-bit JPEG file, 80 for the quality, and then go ahead and open it up in GIMP. So I've already done that, and we're going to take a look here at the Levels tool in GIMP now. So I'm going to go up to Colors, and let's select Levels, and we basically have the same information. The histogram is showing that detail is missing on both sides. We have a gap, and we can fill that gap in with our markers here on either side. Now we have a little teeny tiny line right here, so that's why I'm stopping right here. And I think with this white point now along the edge, I think that's too bright. So I'm going to go ahead and bring this back just a little bit. And then you have your before and after in GIMP. So pretty much the same results. But what I want to show you here is a couple other things that we haven't talked about yet. And I would use the Levels tool when I'm using, or editing, I should say, a JPEG file. 99% of the time I'm editing raw files because that's what I shoot. But if a client gives me a JPEG file, this is how I would set up the white and the black point. So if you're not shooting raw and you're shooting JPEG instead, then you're going to use your Levels tool to set your white and black points. Now, if your histogram is really flat and it doesn't have these really tall peaks like this, you may want to change from the linear histogram to a logarithmic histogram. So just click right here and it's going to change the height of that histogram. 9 times out of 10, I use this, but once in a while I may need to use this histogram to see those peaks and valleys a little bit better to help me edit my image. Another thing that I would do with the Levels tool, instead of using the exposure slider here, or this exposure tool, you can adjust your exposure from here by adjusting the midtone. So now I can make it darker or brighter by adjusting this midpoint versus going back into the exposure tool here and doing it from here. All right, so that's it for the Levels tool. Next up is the Curves tool.